So Carlee Price, lovely to have you here. Could you introduce yourself and then dive right on into the talk?
Sure, and I've actually got a slide in my deck that's the About Me section. So if we could just dive right in, and thank you all for your introductions. I find it very helpful to learn where everyone is coming from. And I apologize, you'll see the bookmarks bar up there. There was just no way to get rid of that. So we will have to grin and bear it. Can we see that okay?
Yep.
Great. So as you know, we're here to talk about cash flow modeling for startups. I am here with the mic because of my background. So I've got 17 years on Wall Street. I was a buy-side equity investor and portfolio manager for people in the room who know what that means. Basically analyzing top-tier companies for investability. I transitioned, spent 7 years in private equity, started angel investing in 2014 and have made 14 angel investments since that time. I serve as a board member and advisor to this day and work full-time in a director of finance role for an organization with about 75 million in revenues and roughly 600 million in fixed assets, serving about 30,000 people a day. My details are there. Please feel free to reach out if you have any follow-ups from the presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions throughout. I can't see you because I'm looking at the presentation, but John, if you could just let me know if someone has their hand up.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I'm very happy to pause and often find that the questions work best when they're positioned at the right point in the slide deck. So please don't be shy. Hold on. Okay, so what we'll cover today is basically 4 buckets of information. Why are financial forecasts important? What should they measure? How is a model built? And then when is the information useful? I noticed from the intros, we have a great number of founders in here. So you should also know that this presentation is mostly oriented towards founders, but that investors can also take this information and simply apply it to their due diligence process. So something for everyone today. Hold on. Okay, so building a financial model gives you greater understanding of your business and increases your probability of success. So it's true no matter how numerate you are, how well you understand or enjoy working with numbers, or where you are in your startup journey. Often people skip this step or shortchange it, and there are a variety of reasons for that. So if there's one thing that I hope you walk away from this presentation with today, it's that this is important work, it deserves your attention, and that you will get tremendous returns from paying attention to your financial modeling, even in the earliest days. The most important factor, of course, and maybe the only factor that determines startup success is viability. So here we're talking about the process of moving from having an idea to having a working business. This is one of validating and confirming viability. Can this thing actually be built? Will people pay for it? And then, of course, will that happen with enough frequency and in the right proportion that the business can survive? So you'll see here Wikipedia's definition of a startup and the viable business model I've highlighted. It feels to me like the most important thing on this page. So ideas are proven with a compelling narrative and viability is proven with numbers. A common place that founders start in the viability validation journey is with their pitch. A pitch is the means by which founders validate their idea with experts, and the experts in the case of a pitch are the investors in the room. So we're counting on those people to understand what we're thinking about in terms of our business and to come along for the ride. Can I convince others to join me? That's the question that pitches answer. There's, of course, benefit to spending time on your pitch. When you work through a pitch, you get very specific about your story and its merits. It's also true with your model. So when you build a model, you're getting very specific about the financial realities of what you're setting out to do. Specifically, what needs to happen financially in order for you to succeed. You should spend as much time building your model in those earliest days as you spend on your pitch. And the two, in fact, can work beautifully together. Okay, so here's what we commonly see in the pitch deck when it comes to numbers. These may be aspirational and well suited to the purpose of fundraising, but this is not modeling. Neither of these two things, we've got the total addressable market image on the right, and then the traditional hockey stick growth forecast, the left, and then the hockey stick on the right. Neither of these two things gets us closer to understanding if the business is viable. So viability begins with understanding the business model. It's not about theory. It's not about generalities. You need to approach this in the same manner as you do your pitch. So build it with the same endpoint in mind and with the same attention for detail. And then ultimately the two will work together to build your conviction in the path forward. So that was the why. Thinking about the what, you have to build a financial model that allows you to see the math behind your business and to allow those numbers to stand out. Turning money into sales is effectively the core of any business. So when we start to think about modeling, what we're thinking about specifically is how the money flows in and out of your business. This is as unique to you as any other element of your business and can also be a competitive advantage. If you understand this well, if you work to make these numbers strong, and if you have strong and repeatable numbers, you will literally be unstoppable. So here we're talking about customer acquisition, we're talking about product profitability, we're talking about the timing of cash flows, reinvestment, and then repeatability. So the goal here is to understand the information that you create in this model well, and then to communicate it simply. So what I've captured here is a slide from a deck that was presented by a company called Buffer. They started out, I believe, in 2010 and are still in business today. And the reason I've chosen this slide is because they're one of the few that I've leafed through in all of my days that actually refers to some very specific numbers here. And on the next slide, I've just zoomed in to show the detail. So what you'll see is they've noted that a 5% churn, et cetera. Behind these numbers is a robust financial model. And having a slide like this in your pitch deck can help open the conversation and demonstrate to investors that you know in extreme detail what's going on with the business and how the business will financially work. So if you can get to a place where this is one of your slides, where one of your slides includes this type of information, you are way ahead of the game. So the strength of your business comes down to the power of these numbers and the power of the ratios that come out of them. Your financial metrics are as unique as your business is and should be considered the same way. You can't use industry standards. You can't sub those in. You have to do the work around your business specifically. Understanding these numbers and being able to communicate them gives you superpowers, and there's no better place for this type of information than in your pitch. So then on to the how, and I know a lot of you mentioned in the opening comments that you're at a startup, you've done some of this type of work elsewhere, but perhaps the startup financial modeling process itself is new to you. So where do you start? Modeling is not an accounting exercise, but accounting principles can be extremely helpful. So anyone with an accounting background, even if it's just a course or two in your undergraduate degree, is going to be an advantage here. So a couple key points. You want to keep your model simple. Okay, so sophistication is not the goal here. We understand everyone is pressed for time. Rather than trying to get the work to be perfect, approach it as you would any other element of your startup. It just has to be good enough initially. There's 4 elements that you want to target at your first pass. Number 1, what is it that drives sales? Number 2, what is it that determines profit? And then number 3, what is it that dictates your capital needs? You're going to build this so it can be revised easily. So nothing you do in startup land and specifically in financial modeling is written in stone. It's always pencil. So understand that these numbers are going to change as your understanding of the business changes. These numbers are going to change as you validate them and gain experience in the real world that causes you to change your view of each of these numbers. And just be prepared to revisit this model frequently and to make changes and update your vision of what this means for the company.
So back up a little bit for me, Carlee. I bet that a bunch of people just currently nodded their head and agreed with you, but could not act on what you just said. And so can you dive in specific about what you mean by drive sales, what you mean by determines profit? And as far as I can tell, dictates capital needs is a pull a random number out of the air, not a dictate thing. So can you explain what dictate?
Yeah, I've got three slides coming up that go into detail on each of these.
Thank you.
Okay. So this, just coming back to the simplicity angle, this is not it. This feels overwhelming to a great majority of startup workers, startup founders, and this is not what we're looking for. You may eventually get to this place, but when you're taking a first stab at this, a 3-line, 16-column spreadsheet is just fine. Start with what you have and start focusing on the things that are most important rather than trying to win by overpopulating something. So John asked me to go into some more detail, and I did. I just put these slides together. When we think specifically about driving sales, it was number 1 on that list I gave you a couple of slides ago. What do I mean by that? So here we've got a chart, and I did borrow this from Dave Parker. He is another active sort of advisor, investor in the local community. Many of you may know him. So he's basically broken down sales drivers into 6 different buckets. This is just an example. There will be other ways to drive sales, but this is a place to start. So for each of these, you should understand how your business specifically, what your business needs to spend in order to drive a sale through one of these channels. Okay, the last one on this list is not the one you want to rely on, but it is typically what we see when we dive into startup founders numbers, especially with that hockey stick chart. This is really what people are expecting by default. So you start with a table like this, you put some thought into which of these channels will be most important for you in bringing sales in, bringing customers to your door, and then how much each customer, each sale requires you to spend in that specific channel in order to drive the sale. So this can look like Facebook ads. This can look like Google AdWords. The other thing to keep in mind with this is that these numbers will change regularly. So you have to build your model and then you have to maintain your model. Something like SEO is a great example. So a change in the cost of a Google AdWord that drives business to your website can fundamentally change the value of your business. And it does that by changing the amount of money you need to spend in that particular channel to get that customer to click buy. This can happen at any time. It happens without warning. So one of the reasons why it's important to be flexible and to be constantly tending to these numbers is so that you know when something like that is about to affect your business and how you conduct business. So the first most important ratio you need to think about, often we start with that very sharp revenue increase. What's behind that? What are you spending in order to make those incremental sales happen? To get specific about it, to build your ratios around it, and then to keep it current. Because the other thing you don't want a model to do is to become dated and start giving you faulty information. I'm going to pause there for questions.
Carlee, could you speak a little bit to how you put assumptions into your model? I've seen a number of times where assumptions are kind of buried in detailed cells, and so it's not necessarily clear exactly what assumptions are driving what parts of the model. Are you going to get into that later, or do you want to speak a little bit?
No, I'll talk about that now. That's a great question, Caitlin. So there's 2 different schools of thought on this. One is that you need an assumptions table. So it's a table that often appears in the upper left of the spreadsheet, and all of your critical assumptions are there. The cells below refer to that. The other is that you just color them with a different color or highlight them in some way, and they actually appear in the sheet. The critical thing is that the numbers, the income statement figures, the profitability figures that come out of your spreadsheet are all reliant on those. So you're not simply stating them and using them nowhere in the spreadsheet, but you're stating them and making sure they form a critical piece of what follows. So everything should flow out of those assumptions.
Any other questions?
Carlee, apologies. You said not to get too detailed. If you have a V2 iteration coming at month 18, that'll change your rev structure. Do you would like that as a line item or a drop down in any way, or is that too? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the other critical thing with models, and we'll get into that a little bit more, is that where there are inflection points in your business, this needs to be captured. So when I say don't go into too much detail, it doesn't mean like create one column and then assume everything else is a plus 5% from that. But don't, for example, say we need 3 salesmen. One of them is going to be Sally. She's going to earn this. One of them is going to be Bob. He's going to earn that. But just to really keep it focused on the things that matter, and something like introducing a new product would definitely matter. So make sure that's in there.
And taking outside funding should produce discontinuity in your J curve. If you have an exponential curve that's smooth, there's no maturity on your funding structure.
I had a question. What is the time frame that you use to project this out? Are we looking 3 months, 6 months, 1 year? Like, what would be a good detailed time frame, but also the right kind of longevity to put your model together?
It's going to depend on the business and, for example, how long the sales cycle is. So 3 months isn't going to be enough for like a med tech product where the sales cycle is extremely long. For a bakery, 6 weeks could be plenty to start with. So it completely depends on how long it takes you to start to see that revenue momentum. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the further you get into the future, the less certainty there is in those numbers that you're projecting. So we don't want, for example, a 10-year model is probably too much in the vast majority of cases. A 3-week model is definitely not enough in the vast majority of cases, but something in between that reflects the cadence of your business will work nicely.
It's also going to depend what your inflection point looks like. If you're going out trying to raise money, people are going to want to know, where's that going to get you, right? So there's also kind of, what are you using it for?
Yeah, 100%.
So every company should be running a quarterly cash flow rolling projection so that they know what their cash for this quarter is going to look like. And that's a very different process than the pro forma that's looking out into the future and trying to model the maturity of the different numbers. So my cost of customer acquisition should mature over time in some way. Sometimes that's beneficial, sometimes that's not beneficial. But those two spreadsheets are not actually the same spreadsheet.
For customer acquisition costs, how do you determine those? And let's say for the paid search, do you just basically run a simple Google AdWords model and figure out how much it would cost you to drive and close the customer? Or because you mentioned that maybe we shouldn't take it from industry comparables. Mm-hmm. We should do our own modeling. Pretty practical. So can you just give me an example how you would do it?
Yeah, so the key here is experimentation. So you want to run experiments. So you want to, for example, buy a Google AdWord, set your expectations. I expect I'll put $500 towards this campaign, and I expect to get so many click-throughs, 35 click-throughs, 2 to fill out the contact me form, and 1 purchase. And then you actually run that experiment and see if your results were similar to what you expected. Use the actual results in your assumptions table. Mm-hmm. Industry standards are fine to start with, but it's going to be quite far from what you experience as an individual business.
Great. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Cool. And then the next piece, of course, is sales profitability. So how profitable is each of those customers that you've brought in through those sales channels that were on the previous slide? And here the key thing is to be honest. So, and this is also where we meet accounting principle number 1, which is completeness. So you'll notice that any set of accounts is going to be complete and final, meaning it's captured everything, every financial activity that's happened in that period. You don't leave things off of your chart of accounts or out of your ledger because you don't like them. But with modeling and with building these ratios, sometimes the temptation can be strong to leave things out that feel like other expenses or head office overhead, things like that, in order to make the numbers feel a little bit more approachable. But with these types of models, it's very important to be complete so that when the real numbers start to come in, there's a relationship between the two, right? So in this case, with the profitability, we're thinking about spending either as a means to drive a customer into the sales line or as a means to deliver the product to that customer. And here you'll see a slide that was from sort of a lemonade stand example. The quick background on this is John and I did a talk that was built entirely around a lemonade stand. How does a lemonade stand as a startup look from a financial perspective? So the lemonade stand buys its product on Friday, sells it on Saturday. You'll see on Friday that there are certain expenditures, these are coded in red, that are really customer acquisition costs. So these would go into the customer acquisition cost ratio. Everything else is in blue. So blue is the cost of actually delivering that product to the customer. The rent table and signs is in purple because you're using a bit of judgment here. Is that the cost of doing business or is that the cost of promotion? It's a bit of both. So you get to kind of make the call there, just be consistent about it. And then in green, we've got the Saturday sales, which is the sales ratio. This is the numerator on your ratio of like the customer acquisition costs. So here we've got a very simple, very small example of a startup business that has some startup costs, and then it has one period of revenues, and how this founder might approach the beginnings of a financial model. He's captured everything, every expenditure and every revenue that's come in, and now he's going to sort them out and figure out what he might expect when he does this again next weekend. He can start to move the flyers expense up and down and see what happens as a result of that on the revenue side. He can change his recipe a bit and see what happens as a result of that on the profit side. And these things all work together. But to give you a very simple example of how those expenditures and revenues break out and into which bucket they belong, this is a good example. Any questions?
So for anybody who's thinking about this in terms of the renting table and signs, I would think about that as if you're only planning on having one table and you're going to have it over multiple days, and this is a single item, that's more of a fixed cost. But for every lemonade stand I set up, now this becomes part of my COGS because it's that repeated cost. So just as an example for people who maybe don't know what the variables are there, it's really what are the assumptions about how your business grows and what you'll need to make it happen.
Perfect, thank you.
So Carlee, how would you pull the assumptions out of this implied set of costs for the lemonade stand? And then how would you evolve this into the expanding neighborhood that conquers 5,000, the process of expanding it across the US to all 6,000 chambers of commerce kind of thing, right?
Sure. So you'd assume that if you were to spend $15 in any community, and again, any community piece is the part that you validate through the expansion itself, you're going to assume that any $15 amount that you spend on signs is going to bring in $240 worth of sales. That's your assumption. That's what goes into the model. Then you assume that any $240 of revenue that comes in brings with it $167 worth of expenses. Right. So this is one data point. Over time, you'll have many data points and your numbers will become more stable. But for this person, it's a highly profitable and it's a high return on advertising spending, on marketing spending model. So this person should have as many lemonade stands as they can, as quickly as they can, because this is a great business here. Nothing ever looks like this.
Yeah, I was about to say, Carlee, is there something to you that that ROAS just doesn't make sense? You're like, yeah, your CAC's $18 and your LTV is $400,000. Like, question? Like, I mean, well, candidly, especially on the SaaS side with evaluations, I'm just wondering in your head, like, oh, God, it's a terrible question. Do you downplay the number?
I think the key thing with where those numbers start to look really out of whack is that the validation piece may be incomplete. So we tend to get unstable numbers when it's a statistically insignificant sample. If you've done 400,000 of these transactions and that's your ratio, then that's your ratio. And you can assume a degree of erosion as you move forward, because obviously you're not going to get to a $50 billion business with that type of spending. But I wouldn't downplay it. The worst thing you can do to a number is start to manipulate it, because it ceases to have value.
Carlee, in this model you have here, you have the cost of printing the flyers, but where's the labor associated with hanging those flyers around town, or deciding where you're going to put the flyers, or where's the labor associated with that marketing? Yeah,
so there's labor over here. We've just put the signs up the morning of the lemonade stand opening. So this is the money we've paid our little cousin to both set up, man, and take down the lemonade stand.
Okay, so you're combining the labor for the number of days the lemonade stand's being run with the marketing costs.
Yeah, and I see your point. So you could include some labor over here, like going to the print shop to pick up the flyers. You could include a bunch of things. This is meant to be extremely simple.
So one of the things that I encourage people to do is to have a separate tab where all of the details of the assumptions are at. So my rent cost per square foot, my taxes, my labor, pay rates, and all of that, all in one page, so that I can go to that page and look at them. But then to color the backgrounds of those based on, have I measured that? Did I get it from a report, or did I pull it out of somebody's hat? And so try to get to the point where the green ones are the ones I measured and the red ones are the ones I pulled out of a hat, and try to run the experiments to make that nice and clean so I can see where my experiments are getting. And then the other thing that I like to do is to try to make sure that the numbers are not just dragged across, that there's some modeling of the maturity of each of those things. So you might have separate tabs for how your marketing channels mature, how your need for management matures. You might have a HR tab. And so there might be many sub tabs that reflect the model over time. That still gives you a very simple page at the front that gives you the J curve, but that J curve is going to be a little bit on the lumpy as your fixed costs come in. Do you see people doing that, or do you see people doing a one-page spreadsheet that's just black and white with lots of assumptions buried?
You're going to start off simply. So most of the time, I'm primarily a pre-seed and seed stage investor, and most of the time you don't see any model at all. At least 7 years ago, this is true. So certainly there will be an increase.
What do you mean you don't see any model at all?
I've invested in probably 10 companies that had no model at all.
No model of what? Model of revenue or model of maturity on any of their costs?
Model of revenue.
Ouch.
Yeah. Because remember, this wasn't the way for a long time. For a long time, what we saw was the J curve table and the SAM-TAM slide, and that was it. So the argument goes that it's too early to know. It's too early. You're pre-revenue. You're just making assumptions anyways. And we know that in 15 years, our market size is 100 million, and we'll have a 1% share of that. So we'll be a $10 million company. And that's sort of the end of the conversation.
So Carlee, is it kind of SAM-TAM and then founder bet, really?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And
I would say even today, though. Sorry, go ahead, John.
The earlier you get, the more it's a founder bet rather than a SAM-TAM even. go ahead.
I was just going to say, even now, even though there's a request for these things, I don't get the impression that most people are actually making a decision based on the content. I think it's more understanding what assumptions are being made, what parts of the model the founder really understands, and what parts do they really need to go out and validate. And it's really the tool to have, it's kind of like the technical interview versus the are you a culture fit interview, right? It's the equivalent in really understanding what do you understand about your business or not.
100%.
So at what point, should we be encouraging startups who are pre-revenue to develop a model? Because, I feel like at some point it's random number generation, and then at some point it's not. So I'm mentoring startups, and I honestly I don't know when it starts to become sort of worth it if they're pre-revenue.
So in the following the line of experimentation that Carlee was talking about, in my simplistic worldview about how startups work, I would say that your unit economics happen right before the second beer in the pizza and beer. When you're thinking about, I have this idea, and you pull out the napkin and you draw on the napkin the unit economics before the second beer. And you've done the financial modeling in that first hour from when you had the idea. And if you can't make the model of the unit economics work in some gross order of magnitude sort of way there, then you probably should stop. And if you can make that work, then the next question is, how do I prove this on the onesie twosie with individuals and see who's interested? And that's also something you should be tracking numbers on, like your conversion rates. I talked to 100 people and I got one person to say yes, that I would come to a workshop, and they got $25 to come to the workshop. Now I actually measured that transaction, and that number actually goes into the spreadsheet, and it says, I got to talk to 100 people to get one person to say yes to the beginning of my funnel. And there's still 5 more steps in my funnel, but I've already begun that experimentation analysis thing at the very beginning. So I believe that the financial modeling happens within the first hour of the business. And I believe that the content strategy for the business happens shortly thereafter. And so I don't think anybody can afford to pull numbers out of a hat and rely on them. So they have to be experimenting to measure the numbers. So there's my soapbox. Carlee, you have a soapbox?
What John said.
I want to offer the comment that I'm very early and have probably a too complicated spreadsheet already, and definitely has a bunch of made up numbers in there, but I can at least see that if I can hit those numbers, it works. And also I know what numbers affect the results, so I know which ones I need to look into more. So I think just having the sort of structure in place, the formulas, so you can see what numbers changes the outcome is really useful, even if I don't have any revenue or data on any of these yet. I know what data to go get.
So the question in my mind would be then, what is the weekly habit that you have of comparing your activity this week to the numbers you expected to have this week, so you can validate that in a concrete way? So if you have no review habit, then you're just hoping you're just hoping that your financials work. If you have a review habit where you're reviewing every Friday morning, you spend 2 hours making sure that what I spent my energy on and the outcome that I got out of that has some alignment, and you revise your spreadsheet, then hallelujah.
And I like John's suggestions as well about color coding those assumptions depending on which stage of validation they're at. So those that you're less certain about, to code in different colors so that your eyes immediately go to those. You know roughly where you should be focusing your time over the next little while.
I don't think it helps, but we use the Wayback, because Dave Parker gave it to us. Sorry, Carlee, he did the same thing. Dave Parker gave us the Wayback Machine. So for us, when we wanted to change some of our, when we added, that's what I was asking about that V2 and whatnot. When we added some bells and whistles, we didn't want to know kind of at what point that changed, like iteratively what changed that percentage wise on our subdocs. So we literally went through the Wayback Machine, did some competitor analysis saying, cool. At this point, they're at this point. When they added this widget, they bumped it to a 47% bump. And so we kind of triaged off of that. So I would say if you want to look at some data from the history as to when your competitors or people in the same space decided to bump subscriptions or whatever the pricing might be for revenue, for more bells and whistles, the Wayback Machine was really, really, really helpful for us.
Cool. And just before we leave this slide, then we're going to talk about fundraising next, but to keep it in this world that we've built here. So this model between the Friday and the Saturday, which is one cycle for this business, they've generated $73 in profit. And what that means is that they do not need external financing for this business unless they want to expand beyond 4 additional stores in their next iteration. So a business that throws off profits quickly is able to scale much more effectively on its own without external financing. Now, the odds that you're going to have a business that has such a short product profitability turn and that is so profitable is quite low. But for this example, this company doesn't need external financing. If the profits were lower or negative, and the appetite of this business to grow quickly was greater than what was allowed within the boundaries of the business generated cash flow, then they would need to think about fundraising. And that's where we get to the next slide.
Yeah.
So the timing and the size of your fundraising activities is critical to your ultimate financial outcome. So differently, the amount of money you raise every time you raise money shrinks your overall share in the business and means that at exit, you're going to take home less than some of the stakeholders you've involved along the way. So minimizing the amount of outside capital that comes into your business is an important goal from a sort of net worth perspective. It's also critical for you to optimize the timing of these instances. So the second thing that a financial model should do is to let you know how far you can go with the cash on hand before needing to bring capital in from outside the company. So John spoke earlier about the cash flow model, and this is critical both from that fundraising perspective and to ensure that the company remains in business. So the number one killer of businesses comes down to one thing, and it's a lack of cash. The company that dies is the company that's run out of money, essentially. So when we think about fundraising, we're thinking about using the model to show when the business, as it's imagined in the model, is likely to require outside capital. And then to understand, again, to John's earlier point about what is the inflection that that capital injection will create in the business itself. So any questions on this one? Everybody loves fundraising.
Do you need to know the milestones that it's going to go towards, Carlee? Would you like to know as an investor, cool, this is going to go here, here, here,
Yeah.
here?
Sure, and that's where having those assumption numbers dialed is incredibly helpful, because you can essentially tell, in a perfect world, you could tell a set of investors from whom you're raising $10 million. We're going to put $1 million here, and from that bucket we expect to get this as a result. We're going to put $1 million here, and from that bucket, and this line of sight is exactly what an investor is looking for in a perfect world. Doesn't mean you won't be off by some margin of error on each of those factors, but being able to speak with that level of information is really, really useful. Other questions? Okay. So now accounting principles. I don't know if we have any accountants in the room. Oh, I know we have at least one accountant in the room. Accounting principles can be helpful in your approach. So anybody, again, who's even taken an accounting course knows that there are some principles of accounting that are universal. One is completeness. So again, we're not leaving things out because they don't feel like direct expenditures to us. We want everything to be captured in those ratios so that we know what's coming and we aren't surprised by expenses that weren't contemplated in the model. Reconciliation means that your numbers should balance going sort of working from the ratios outwards and then backwards as well. So you should be able to build your income statement from the assumptions and build the assumptions from the income statement. And then standardization is the third principle, which means to use the same approach in all periods. You can change the approach if it makes sense, but you can't change the approach period by period when looking across time in a single model. Cool. So to summarize, principles for building from scratch: keep it simple, engage with the content regularly. This means setting aside time in each and every week that you are a startup founder to look back on your assumptions to ensure that any adjustments that need to be made are made, and then to see the results that fall out of that work to the forward-looking forecast, and then to be complete and consistent. And then finally, on the question of when to do this work, the model is part of your ongoing business responsibilities. What happens after you've built it is that you transition from an idea stage company to an operating business, and you start to integrate reality into what your early expectations were. So at some point, if you're pre-revenue now, you will no longer be pre-revenue, and you will have actual accounting statements to compare against your forecasts. And this is the part where a lot of people get lost. So your forecast, your model, and your financial statements have to live in the same world, right? One of the challenges to this is that the chart of accounts is going to be set up in a different format than your model. Your model is built to be functional and make sense to you and to highlight the most important things. A set of financial statements is built to adhere to accounting standards and be acceptable to things like a tax agency or to an auditor. So these are created in two absolutely different manners, but they must work together. So when you get your set of financial statements and it looks different than your model, step one is don't panic. Step two is don't be tempted to complicate your model to match the chart of accounts. So many people would love to download their income statement and paste those numbers into their model and sort of have everything update. But what that drives is an overly complicated model that isn't focusing on the things that are most important. You don't want to abandon the work. You don't want to overly complicate it. What you have to do at this stage is learn to move between the two. So find a way that works for you to bridge from your financial statements back to your model, and that these two things can work together. Otherwise, you'll get lost. Your model will fall out of date. The financial statements will become a mystery to you because you've spent so much mental time in the forecast in the model world. You need to know both languages, and you need to know what they mean one for the other. Cool. And then again, our confidence in these numbers is always meant to be growing over time. You have to pay attention to them in order to do this. What we're looking for at the first iteration is the house on the left. It's just meant to keep you dry and warm. It's not meant to be beautiful. Over time, you'll make changes to the model. You'll spend time with it. It'll start to look like a really nice house, and eventually it'll serve all of your purposes. So the steps are build, and then confirm either through experimentation or through actual customer results. You're going to change your model. You're going to observe how the output of the model changes when you change your assumptions. This is a critical step. There's an action and a reaction. So when you change something in the model as a reflection of what you've learned about the real world, the output of the model will change. The value of your business will change. So take note of that and start to understand how those mechanics work. And then, of course, you're always looking to adjust your strategy based on what the model is telling you. So when those Google AdWords costs change and that particular vector starts to be lower return, you have to adjust in response and maybe spend more money, for example, on your Facebook ad campaign as opposed to your Google AdWords campaign. So there's always an action and a reaction, and the real power in a financial model comes from linking those two things together. What am I learning in this period, and how am I reacting or adjusting my behavior in future periods?
Hey, Carlee, would it be possible to take 2 seconds and kind of talk about this build, confirm, change, observe, adjust, and then kind of reference it into, let's say we put $1 million into it, our churn or our burn, our runway, our break-even analysis, and why that even like at what month that is for us then to be profitable, and kind of how, as an investor, it makes, what would you like to see when you give us X amount of dollars?
So all we can know at the time the investment is made is what you expect, right? And that's going to be a single thing captured at a single point in time. What can be helpful on top of that is to discuss how you've responded to change in the past. So if we had been doing this raise 2 years ago, we might have deployed the money in this fashion because what we understood at that point was X. Now we understand Y, so our plans are Y. And what that demonstrates as a founder is that you are flexible and that you are paying attention. You can also start to get into sort of boundaries like statistical probabilities. So we expect our Google AdWords campaign to return this, but what we've learned is that there's a high degree of variability, so it could be on this tail or this tail. A truly robust business model will be able to respond to those sort of one standard deviation events and still remain healthy. It's not always the case, but being able to speak in sort of multiple dimensions about the static numbers that you have on your page can be really, really powerful.
I think I heard Raj asking about some of the key metrics that you're seeking to understand in your model. Can you dive into what the sort of bones of the model is that are places where you need to pay extra attention?
Yeah.
Because John makes a great point. Like, what if, God forbid, like we raise our money, we blow through it, we go right back to the till to the water, and we don't really have a good explanation as to what happened.
Oh, well, that's a very bad problem to have. You should
always. I know. I know. I know.
Yeah, just pray. You should always know what happened. You should always know why the money went where it went, and what you were expecting, how reality was different. And then the only piece that might be a tiny mystery is why it was different than expected. But all those other pieces should be well within your reach.
And if you're taking lots of small bites at the apple instead of one big bite, then you should have been able to do some adjustments along the way that got you to something that was working.
I would say that one again, because we saw a raise of $1.6 million blown in 3 months, and it went back to, and they were just like, nope. It was impressive.
There are many ways to flame out. Yes.
So just getting back to the original, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the flip side, we've also seen where people are raising without a specific milestone they're hoping to achieve with that raise. And so that's the other thing, you know, on the one hand, you don't want to take off too much, but on the other hand, if you don't actually have an inflection point that de-risks the company in some way or changes the value of the company in some way, then going back for that next round can also be a challenge. So trying to find that middle ground, especially for companies pre-revenue. You know, a lot of the healthcare related startups are people who are coming from either medical or the lab, who don't necessarily know what these things cost and don't necessarily know what a sales cycle takes. And so, you know, being able to identify where those assumptions are and how you need to refine them along the way can be a big part of that.
And I would add to that short of milestones, you should be able to explain when you come back to the market what you've learned in that time. A company can miss its milestones, but if it's missed learning entirely about its business, it shouldn't be doing a second raise. So it may not be a milestone that was clearly delineated at the time in the first raise, but there should be some understanding that the company has gained about their market, about their product in that intervening period, that maybe wasn't defined as a milestone at the beginning of the process, but still has value and still can facilitate that second raise.
So I think we're diving into the dictates capital needs. And I think what I heard Caitlin say is sometimes people raise 1.6 million because it's a nice number and it looks nice with their valuation that they want. And that's what they saw a bunch of other people in the Bay Area doing, but they weren't sure how they were going to spend it, other than they were going to spend it on bodies to do something. And they didn't know what the bodies were supposed to accomplish. And so then they spent the money and there was no more revenue, and they hadn't actually changed anything about the model. And specifically, they hadn't reduced any of the risks for the company. So they didn't know any better how to get new customers. They didn't know any better how to be productive in terms of their sales process or their reduction of cost or their supply chain, nothing, right? It was just 1.6, put it on Google Ads, spend it, bong, done, no result, no learning, right? So how do we back them up to get them a number that's a meaningful number? If this is a first raise, at least for me, a first raise of 1.6 million is too big, because what it does is it doesn't provide social validation to the investors that you can actually do something. And so raising 250, 300K and then doing something in the next 3 months that de-risks the company in an obvious way is really good social validation, so that you can raise the 2 million or the 5 million in the next round from people that know that you can execute because you have just executed.
Hey, John, this is Alicia. Can I ask a question on that front? And then I apologize if it's not germane to our overarching financial conversation, but I have been consistently told to raise more money in the first round, because if you're going to go through the trouble of raising, $500,000 or $300,000, well, why wouldn't you just go ahead and get 18 months worth of burn out of your first raise?
So the question is really, do you have the relationships with the investors so that that is viable and will work? And remember that 99% of the people that ask for money don't get it. And so in some ways, I'm a bottom-up kind of guy. And so I would like to see you socially validate and get relationships with investors and get relationships with proof that you can execute and evidence that your team is functioning, so that the seeking of money is short and sweet, not long and dragged out. So asking for 2 million when 250 would have been possible to get, and you could have executed on that and done something in the next 3 months, versus spending 6 to 9 to 24 months trying to raise the 2 million. Those are different journeys. I would rather do this short one.
I think also that, for your next raise, you really want your company valuation to increase quite a bit. And if you haven't done a really good job with the first raise of increasing sales, that valuation may not increase. I mean, you get it like a flat round, and that doesn't look good on you. So to me, I agree with John that you really want to kind of hedge your bets on that second raise, and really, especially if you don't have a proven sales process, raise a little bit lower in the first one, and make sure that your spend is consistent with, how much your sales are going up. If you're spending so much more, your sales are not going up at the same amount consistently, your next raise is just not going to be very exciting and may not even happen. So that's my take on that.
And that's why it comes back to what are the milestones, right? So working in medical, we often have more than one round before revenue. So, revenue might not be the goal in your case, but if it's not, then what is the biggest risk to the company, and what can you do to de-risk that before you have to go raise again? And so maybe 200K is not enough, but 400K does actually answer some questions. And, one thing I will say, having worked with a lot of the biggest names in medical and working with little tiny startups, is the way you develop product looks different. So if you're used to a very, even with agile development, all that, you're really used to a linear progression that builds a product over time. Startups often do things in a different order because they have to focus on de-risking. And so kind of thinking about what are you doing to de-risk the business and what it takes to get there may not necessarily look the same as, hey, what's our 2-year plan to take a product to market? So
thank you for that. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so the argument that Patrick Hogan made last week is you should be working on one thing, which is reducing your biggest risk. And then when you get it so that it's not your biggest risk, you should change what you're doing and work on the thing that is your biggest risk, which might be different, right? Is it team risk? Is it execution risk? Is it financial risk? Is it market risk? There's a bunch of different things that need to be focused on, not eliminate all technical risk before I do my sales. That one doesn't work.
So did we answer the original question that brought us back here?
I don't know that we got all the way to burn and churn and the stuff that Raj was talking about. So Raj, what kinds of key financial principles would you like to be measuring in the bones of your financial thing so that you know what's driving your sales and what's determining your profit?
Well, I think it was just, so there was a question posed about raising money. What is it going to do? And at what point, if you run out of that money, is it more of a donation instead of an investment? And for us, when we were running our pro formas, we were running kind of like our break-even analysis, our margins were strong, luckily, as on the SaaS side. So within 3 months, we had our break even. So the reality of the situation for us was our burn was very low. So we didn't have a raise. I'm just wondering, Carlee, at what point on especially in your financials, do you want to see, here's our burn, here's our break even month, and then here's our growth potential. And then how do we iterate on our investment through those milestones? Or is that too much, or just kind of want to see some more superficial stuff? Okay, in Q1 you have here, because we modeled out month over month, then we did Q over Q, we did a full year, and then we did 2 year. We did it 24 months all in, and then we iterated some of our V1s, V2s, and why we take our break-even analysis, especially after the raise. I'm just wondering, at what point does it make sense to you as an investor to say, okay, too much, enough, give me your break-even here? Like, what are some of the key KPIs that you're good with?
Yeah, so it's going to vary by investor, but for me, it makes more sense to go into the details of the where's the money going conversation than about these sort of month by month. So we're going to take $1 million and do X. We're going to take the next $1 million and do Y. That piece of the conversation is much more interesting to me than, and will naturally lead to, this will get us through 24 months conversation, than getting too high level and just saying, here's a bunch of money, here's when it runs out, here's what we hope to achieve. Just to get into the piece by piece detail, the more you can bucket that spending and explain what the output of each will be, the more it starts to make sense, at least from my investor lens. Okay. Did that answer the question? Not sure. Okay, I see nodding, so we'll carry on. All right, so we talked a little bit about accounting, running the business, check the explanations, and then building the house. So this is where we left off, and we were asked what the change the model piece was about and what the observe the output piece was about. But this, again, is just an overall critical slide when thinking about this model as a living document, not as something you do once or you do once every time you need to fundraise, but as something that's integral to the healthy functioning of your business and something that you lean on heavily to help you in guiding your decisions, particularly around capital allocation. And then the final point in this section is that the model is for you, but will help you build trust with a variety of parties. So the model is really about creating accountability for yourself and forcing you to get specific about how your business works from a numbers perspective. But in the process of doing this, you also create a shared language that will help you to communicate with other founders, like the folks in this room who all know what we're talking about when we talk about churn, when we talk about return on marketing spend. It'll give you a shared language to communicate with investors. So I showed you that pitch deck that had the slide snippet and mentioned that adding things like that to your deck really helps to build confidence and speeds the fundraising process in a lot of cases. This is content that you can include in your deal room, and importantly becomes the beginnings of stakeholder reporting. So when you enter the process with a strong financial model and a strong financial understanding, that assembly of the stakeholder report becomes much easier because you now have numbers that you can point to and the mechanics in the business that you understand that can be easily dropped into a newsletter or an update, and again, distributed to your stakeholders to help build confidence between your investors and yourself, and to help that sort of explaining piece of the conversation, the sort of post-mortem of the investment, be much smoother. So it's not just something that you put effort into, helps you raise money and you walk away from it, something that can be critical to the ongoing health of your business and something that you really come to rely on to serve a variety of needs within the company.
So question, what sort of highlights should we look at for putting in something short form like a pitch?
Yeah, so again, I think that slide deck, and I'm gonna try to find it. The slide that Bob, who was it? Give me a minute while I try to find this slide. There it is. So things like this. So this again was a slide from Buffer, right? So, and you'll often see a slide, and I had a LinkedIn slide here before that had a bunch of numbers on it, but they weren't actually financial numbers. But you'll often see a slide in these successful pitch decks that show number of users, churn rate, conversion rate, things like that. You're just adding a sort of monetary context to that. So this one is important because it's talking here about the about the LTV value, right? And then numbers. So $240 is their LTV. Allows us to pay $5. So that kind of thing is very direct. It's very resonant. So investors will get it. And there's a tremendous amount of work behind it. So in putting a slide like this into your deck, you're showing that you've done a volume of work to get to that figure. You can speak confidently when asked to go into detail on it. And it really is very meaningful to your business, perhaps even more than the Sam slide.
Carlee, you talked about building trust and how a financial model can be really instrumental in building trust with investors.
Oh, did we lose Caitlin, or was that me?
No,
it's Caitlin.
Anybody else have a question while we wait for Caitlin to come back into focus?
Certain industries is not public information. Customer acquisition.
Caitlin, I'm not sure what's happening with your stuff, but you might want to turn off your video and ask the question again because we lost most of it.
Oh, sorry. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Does that work, or am I?
Yeah, that's better. You're doing better.
Okay. So Carlee, can you speak to kind of in the relationship with an investor as you get to know each other better, at what stage you're sharing what level of information? So we talk about how the model can build trust on the founder, sharing it with the investor increases in investor confidence. But I hear from founders a lot. We kind of have this conversation around, recognizing that investors aren't signing NDAs, that pitch decks do get shared around, that things need to be non-confidential. Some concern around how much detail is shared in that deck. Can you kind of speak to that?
As a general comment, I find the fear around an investor stealing an idea or sharing it with someone else who's doing the work and impairing the business in that way to be grossly overstated. So if, for example, you can take this slide and build a business out of that, God bless. It simply doesn't happen as frequently as founders fear it might, that sharing information is a threat to their business. Particularly when we're talking about investors. So treating your investors with distrust is a real, can be very problematic.
Yeah, so I more mean early in the conversation when you're reaching out to people who may be a potential investor, right? Not when you have an existing relationship, but people who have asked me kind of, hey, I'm sending a 5-slide deck, right? I'm making that first conversation, and my amazing COGS is something that's a good selling point, but how much do I really want to go into that detail before I really know this investor?
And
again, that was more the context.
Yeah. So you send them a slide and it's got your COGS on there, and that's all they know. So the sauce is not in the number itself. The sauce is in all of the effort. The secret sauce is in all the effort that's gone to produce that number. Again, I would tend to err on the side of oversharing and running the risk that an investor can take a slide out of a 5-deck introductory pitch and recreate your business.
Yeah, I don't think that's what anyone's concerned about. So from your perspective, you would share the full model with somebody you don't know.
Paul, this was kind of using the quote unquote 700-ish active deals in the pipeline now.
Sorry, say that again.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. Maybe Elaine was talking. Yeah, I don't think anyone's worried about an investor recruiting their business model from the 5 slides. People are just trying to figure out where to land on that spectrum. So your standpoint is share the whole model, even with people you don't know. The risks, you have way more to gain than to lose. Is that kind of?
Yeah, and maybe don't spam it out to a list of 300. But what I'm saying is, if people have an appetite for information, you're going to do yourself a lot more harm than good by denying them that information. So if someone comes to you, it's the first conversation. They're like, "Look, I've spent 30 years in finance. The thing I'm most concerned about is the composition of your COGS. This is the reason that's going to carry us into the next conversation or not." You just share it with them.
I also think that it's okay to slow roll that a little bit as you build that relationship. So if I'm working with a founder and they're trying to solicit money and I ask some questions, they can give me some answers. They may not give me like that entire, super deep book, but I'm going to take some of that and then I'm going to ask some more questions from there. And I would expect that they are looking at me to ask relevant questions and show that I'm understanding and digging into their business a little bit, and then they're going to maybe provide me some more information. So as an investor, I don't mind, sort of also, the founder wants to check me out at the same time, and that's cool. So if I have to dig a little bit, I think that's okay as an investor as well. But I agree with Carlee that eventually, if somebody wants to know some specific information and you want their money, then you're going to have to provide it.
All right.
Carlee and John, I had one question. I think John also may be aware. Is there a point where you would not share your pitch deck openly based on the organizations that you're currently working with, that they would not want you to share their information, that you're working with them?
I can't, our expectation in Seattle Angel Conference is that our conversations about the companies that are in our program are kept within our program. And we don't share our due diligence and we don't share any of our information outside our investors unless the due diligence team agrees and the founder agrees that it can be shared. In that context, I can't think of any reason why we wouldn't want our stuff shared, right? Sometimes our commentary and the due diligence is a little bit brutal, and we don't need to be brutal with our founders, so we rewrite it a little bit so it's a little more gentle when we share it. But I don't think anybody's cut out critical thought. The fundamental thought is there. It's just the presentation of the thought that gets edited sometimes.
John, I think the question's more if you have a relationship that you've established with a big client, but you're under NDA with them, so you're not actually able to share who the client is in a public way. Is that what you were more looking at, John?
If the company has NDAs in place that they can't be sharing, then what we would ask is that they go either find representatives that are proxies for that, or that they ask the client directly to share, that it'd be okay to share this information with this specific set of investors, because often that will help the client get what they want faster. We have had that happen in the past, actually.
And another general thought on just sharing information with investors, like we can look at it from a slightly different perspective, and that is relationship building, because after all, we want to build relationships with investors so we can move to the next stage of due diligence. And from that perspective, sharing numbers early on, just like the whole thing right away, may not be the wisest, because It's easy to poke holes in numbers, and people don't really make relationships based on numbers. There's a really good book by Oren Klaff. It's called Pitch Anything. And he really talks about that, like, hot cognitions versus cold cognitions, like, developing desire versus like analysis by paralysis, where people just like don't want to make a decision. And so based on that perspective, I would really only share numbers that like lead to the next stage of due diligence. And like they're like an appetizer, as a teaser to the sort of the big reveal at the end, just another angle.
I think that's what Alan was meaning when he said roll it out slowly. But yes, I agree with what you just said.
Carlee, are there any sort of, how do I describe it, explanations of financials that you have been a stop for you when you invest in companies, like the way people talk about it? I'm mostly curious, not about like building the financial model, but how people speak about it when they're walking you through. So what mistakes people made, and what particular language would you suggest?
Mm-hmm. So there are definitely standards in the industry. So customer acquisition cost is a very popular standard. Lifetime value is another very popular standard that's lost a bit of zhuzh in the last little while. So you'll learn over time what people are used to hearing about. Here you have to be very responsive to your audience. So in any pitch environment, in any investor founder conversation, you need to sort of understand what level they're at and what interests them. Said differently, pitching to a room full of doctors in a healthcare startup incubator will be very different than pitching to a room full of people with mixed backgrounds, such as Seattle Angel Conference. So the language you use when talking about numbers needs to reflect your understanding of the audience you're speaking to. And the only mistakes you can make is either over speaking and losing your audience, or under speaking and insulting them, or starting to feel cagey. If the audience doesn't trust you with your information, that can be another problem as well.
Thank you. What can you give me a couple of examples that would be like a stop for you, personally?
For me personally, is this a room full of other people, or is this like a one-on-one conversation?
A one-on-one conversation.
Yeah, so I mentioned it a couple of times, and I'll come back to it, is that if you can bucket your raise into specific campaigns or targets or specific outcomes, that really appeals to me, because I'm a very logical thinker and I like to have accountability, like very specific accountability. So something like, I'm raising $5 million, 1 million of it will go to inside sales staff. We're expecting to hire 15 people, here's the quotas we're asking of them, etc. Like that sort of conversation appeals to me personally. At the pre-seed stage, it's going to look similar, but on a smaller scale and with a greater sort of degree of uncertainty around the numbers. So at a pre-seed stage, a pre-revenue stage, you might say something like, we're going to spend this first $100,000 chunk on these 8 different things. Based on the outcome of that work, we're going to focus the next 100,000 on 4 of those things. And we're hoping between those 2 phases to be starting to generate 200,000 in revenue. Something like that. Very specific, very sequential, and very measurable. Because otherwise it starts to feel like promotional talk.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And sometimes when people do promotional talk really a lot, not really well, then they trigger the I don't trust you button in some of our investors, at which point the conversation is over. And nobody but the investor knows that the conversation is over. And so really you don't want to feel like you're selling, cold fusion to people. You want to feel like you're demonstrating that you have a workable plan that you can execute on. I think one of the things that you didn't mention, Carlee, that is worth mentioning is that investors are looking for a movie, not a snapshot. And so they're going to come back, this is a series of meetings. And so they're going to come back and dig deeper and going to come back and dig deeper. And what you're saying should evolve between those meetings as you make progress, because you're a growth company evolving, making progress. And if you're giving the same answers meeting after meeting after meeting and just practicing the pitch harder, but not adapting it to the fact that I already told you this and now I don't have to tell you that again. I might remind you a little bit about it, but no, I can go deeper in and show you how things have changed since the last time we talked and why I learned something. That's really useful. That whole notion that the audience should be seeing you evolve.
Gotcha. And if you're showing your financial model, let's say it's Excel spreadsheet, right? Would you say, hey, can I walk you through it, right? Like, would you send it in email, or would you say like, hey, here's the model, but I want to walk you through it so investors don't get confused, et cetera, et cetera?
Most investors are not as excited to explore spreadsheets as Carlee is.
Carlee
and
is.
so most of them will like you to walk them through, and then you can leave it afterwards for them to go find their friend Carlee, who will go through it and explain it in more detail. And so I would probably start with let's walk through it together, and then we can go into it in more detail. There are some investors that are very, very good at spreadsheets and love them and live based on them. And so you should find out if that investor you're talking to cares about the world that way. And if they do, support the hell out of them, because they'll be the ones that everybody else goes to find out whether the spreadsheet's correct.
Gotcha. There are many services also that offer this CFO kind of services in Silicon Valley. Would you recommend hiring them at the seed stage, or would you use them later on when you're like raising Series A? I know it's all based on the milestones, etc., but there are many kind of services that suggest that, hey, I could help you build this model with you. I can sort of train you how to talk about this model knowledgeably, right? And then I'm setting you up for success with investors, right? Have you seen startups using it? And how good were I know the answer probably it depends, but have you seen a lot of startups using it in the recent years?
Yes. So this is a great question, because I used to do this work. And one of the packages I offered clients was a pre-revenue package. So it was a fixed price package that allowed a founder who was sort of moderately numerate to develop a set of financial forecasts that made sense and then prepare themselves to speak about those in front of investors. So there is no point at which it's too early. If this feels like a knowledge gap for you, there are absolutely people who are out there available to help. At the same time you think about hiring a lawyer, at the same time you think about hiring a pitch deck coach, you should think about hiring a CFO if that's also a knowledge gap. The beauty of contract CFO work as well is it's often scalable. So no matter which stage you're at and how much volume of help you need, there is somebody out there who can size that serving in the right way for you.
Gotcha.
So it's definitely an area where plenty of people need help. And because of that, a whole ecosystem has grown up that affords this kind of support in very sort of manageable chunks. You may also have an advisor or someone who can weigh in on this stuff, but never be afraid to ask for help, because plenty of people love to do this work and plenty of people are willing to help, either paid or unpaid.
Thank you.
Also, for what it's worth, so on the other side, Carlee speaking as an investor, and I'll speak as a founder. As I mentioned, coming in here, I'm so far removed from the tech side that I was actually very scared to speak to people. I did hire somebody, and it was instrumental, because majority of the time when I talk, it's just kind of this verbal diarrhea. I get in my head with some tangents and some rabbit holes, and everyone's like, yeah, I don't know what you're saying. I was like, okay. And then I did hire somebody because I was so outside of my own comfort zone that it was on a founder's side, it was probably the best thing I've ever done. It was probably the best investment. It wasn't anything major. It was a storyteller helping with my pitch and whatnot, but speaking to the terms and not just kind of going on tangents, especially since it's pretty succinct when you have the attention of someone like Carlee. 7 minutes later, she's on the next investment. So I had to really curtail my entire thought process, and I definitely hired somebody, and it was instrumental. I would greatly, and if you need any more on the storytelling side, for me, I didn't have on the SaaS tech side. So it was very important that I had someone who could help me speak the talk outside of my assumptions. It was very helpful.
I want to double down on what Caitlin said in the chat. We've seen people who have hired people to tell a really good story, or have hired somebody to do their finances, but as a founder, they did not understand their numbers. And more generally, the team did not understand their numbers. So all of the co-founders should understand the numbers in your spreadsheet and be able to speak to them well, and should be able to speak to them in the same direction, right? You can't have the technical guy that's lost in his code who doesn't know when his business is going to be profitable. It shows a team that's not cooperating and effectively working with each other. And we've seen reasonable numbers of Seattle Angel Conference companies that have pitched where it became very clear that the founder didn't understand the numbers and they didn't make any further progress. Yeah, Alicia.
I have a question about how, or what is a reasonable way for an early stage founder to make projections about how many customers we're going to have. You know, I think I'm being very modest and say maybe I'll get 10 new customers in this month, and I keep hearing people say, oh, that's too aggressive, you know, and I heard you say earlier not to just like add 5% to every column, which is what I did in my model. You know, I have no idea, you know, how fast that's going to grow or not grow, and so I welcome any thoughts and advice on that.
So I would say in the simplest form, just think about how those 5 customers are going to find you. So if you think of that slide I showed with the triangle, and it had the bars on the left that showed direct marketing, word of mouth, et cetera, you're expecting 5 new customers. You must also be expecting the mode by which they reach you, right? They're not going to be free.
Right.
They're not just going to show up on the doorstep with a bag full of cash. So what is it that causes them to bring that bag of cash to you? Did they see you on Facebook? Did they hear from a friend? And then get specific about how probable it is that each of those 5 comes through a different channel, and what you've invested in that channel to get them to push that buy button.
So, you know, if you believe in lean startup has one principle. Customer development happens before product development. So when you tell me that I don't know how to get customers and figure out where they're at, then I go back into my little brain rant that I do about lean startup and customer development. And then I start asking about the customer development experiments and the effort that it takes to do marketing at the very beginning, early stages of the company, which is sub market understanding, language understanding of how to communicate to that sub market, and how you're going to sprint to a market that's big enough to be cash flow positive. That work is bigger than the work to build the product. And so for every hour that there's an engineer somewhere building something, and for everywhere that you've got a CFO building something, there should be someone doing that customer development work. And out of that customer development work, there will be a bunch of measured numbers on conversion rates, on content costs, on the process of getting people into channels and which channels work, which channels don't work, to do customer problem fit, just to find the pile of people that have the same problem that you're trying to solve. Didn't say anything about your solution, just customer problem fit. That work is as big as your first 3 prototypes of whatever it is that you're building. Does that help?
I think it's valuable information, but I don't think it answers my question. And so my question was more about like, so how do you put that in the model?
How many people did you call today?
Okay.
Right, you called 50 people today, because a good salesperson calls 50 people. Of the 50 calls, you got 40 that didn't answer or said go away or whatever. 10 of them said, huh? And of those, 2 said, oh, tell me more. And 1 of them paid you money or signed up or did something. And you do that 5 days a week, and now you got 5 people. And how many hours did that take? And how much did that cost? And now you've got a model for that channel. And then you do that. And then you do that again for Twitter, and you do that again for LinkedIn, and you do that again for the YouTube, and you do that again for the sign that's by the gas station, and you do that again for the radio ads. And of the 500 different possible channels, some of them will light up and some of them will be utterly useless. I would argue that Google ads and LinkedIn ads and Facebook ads are utterly useless until you understand a bunch of fundamental things. And so you should be down in the personal, one-on-one conversations with people, not in the broadcast widely and spend $10,000 to get one person kind of thing. And once you find that language to speak to people where you can have the two conversations and it turns into $100 in your bank account, now you can, get clarity on the relationship between the effort on the marketing channel and the revenue you got from that channel. And now you have a cost of customer acquisition and some beginning understanding of lifetime customer LTV, lifetime value. Now, Carlee, what's the equation for the relationship between churn and lifetime value?
Yeah, so lifetime value is basically the amount of money you expect an investor or a customer to give you over the time that they spend with you. So here you need to consider the term of their engagement with you, whether it's a series of one-year subscription renewals or whatever else, and then when they leave. Now, the problem with LTV and the reason it's become somewhat controversial is the further out you get on that model, the more sort of discounting back has to happen. The numbers again become very sort of tenuous at the long end of that tail. So what we've learned about subscription services in the last 10 years is that there tend to be a set of customers that will just stay with you for 10, 15, 20 years. The LTV of that customer at the beginning of that process would have been completely wrong, because it was a 10-year process and because it's extremely difficult to value that 10th year of subscription value in today's dollars. So LTV as a concept is measuring the value of a customer to your business, the effectiveness of that $5 or whatever the amount is you spent to get them in the door, the total value of that. But it gets a bit fuzzy when it comes to things like subscriptions when we start talking about churn.
And
also
so
recognizing competitors entering the space, right? So often people, what your initial churn looks like when you have your most desperate customers, your early adopters who absolutely love what you're doing versus the people who saw a Facebook ad, joined for a month and dropped off again, right? So predicting the behavior. So somebody was just asking, what do you mean by churn? So churn is talking about how many people that become your customers stop being your customer. So if you get 1,000 new customers every month, but 2,000 customers leave every month, then your churn is so bad that you're spending money you're not recovering. So it's looking at the, sorry, Carlee, you probably have a more technical explanation than that.
No, it mostly has to do with SaaS companies. So if you have a bakery, there is no such thing as churn. If you sell a product, there's no such thing as churn. You might almost look at the opposite and think about repeat customers. But churn is very specific to the language of software, generally speaking.
So we also use it in healthcare where you have a reusable product. So with a durable and a reusable, with a reusable and a disposable. So how long they're going to keep that durable in the hospital, they're going to keep with that evergreen income. Got it. So anytime where you have a particular customer who's going to have that repeat business from the beginning of the relationship.
And the only thing I would say there's, yeah, it's also like Alicia, we had a big problem too, because we didn't realize candidly what they were going through. I was very assumptive in my thought process. So I did a full persona slide as who was my end user, like truly what were their metrics of success and how did they measure their success? If like our platforms of LinkedIn, it actually isn't very conducive to my end user. And that was through due diligence and persona slides and whatnot. And then the customer discovery calls were so important to me. And I'll give you the only example where I was just like blown away. We did 67 customer discovery calls that were 15 minutes each. I used a free program called MarsView. MarsView does a transcription. So our 15-minute Zooms, we transcribed every single one of them. We did a small SQL through Python, and we did like a word cloud. And from those word cloud that we embedded all these 80,000 minutes, the top 5 problems were so far from what I actually thought they would be, because that was my assumption. And then I had to take a step back and be like, whoa, I am way off in my thought process. So it really took me some time to take a step back to get how many UATs, how many new users a month I'm going to get, what my churn would be. I didn't just do the incremental cool, 4 or 5% growth, because I knew a Carlee would be like, you're probably just taking 5% growth over the next 18 months, aren't you? I'm like, no, what are you talking about, Carlee? Yes. So it was instrumental for us to understand actually who our persona was, because I made so many assumptions that I thought on the wellness side would work that was so far off. I literally pushed my burden of knowledge and my kind of industry expertise on wellness, be like, oh, it's probably about convenience and finances. And they're just like, yeah, no, the top 5 things, none of them are convenience and finances. Like, okay, I'm way off on my thought process. So it did take some due diligence and real almost analog data to get that churn. It really was onerous, but it took some time and it completely changed our financials, completely changed them.
So we're going to have Dave Parker talk about revenue models and how those revenue models drive out of his book, the Trajectory book, next week. And I put the link into the chat. And so it'll drive into a bunch of these questions. You need to understand the fundamentals of the revenue model to get to the question you were asking about how is it that we make money, and then how do we take that and turn that into customers that pay us that thing. And in this lean startup-y model, the discovering the price happens after discovering the unique value proposition. So there's a whole journey early on that will set some of your numbers. And I believe strongly that a lot of that material ends up down inside your assumptions list. So at the very beginning, all of these little call a bunch of people and measuring those calls, or tweeted a bunch of people, or email a bunch of people, or whatever, turns into experimental data that is informing your financial model. And so which marketing channel will work today is not necessarily the channel that will work at scale in 2 months, and you will be adjusting those as well, right? And so presumably you will have 3 at least marketing channels that actually operate at different efficiencies, but that they help balance out the shifts in them. But if you make it all up out of a hat somewhere, then it will be as good as the hat is, which is, empty. Any other thoughts and questions?
Carlee, could you speak to the fact that you've invested in all these startups that didn't even have a financial model when financial modeling is what you do? Talk to us about that.
So that's a funny story. Yeah, the short version is I was very new to this particular field. I started, as I mentioned, in 2014. So some of it was cultural at the time. It just really wasn't done. It wasn't that common to see financial models, and not wanting to be the sort of agitator in the room, being more in a learning mode. And part of the reason why I then transitioned into being a contract CFO is because it highlighted for me the need for this support. The fact that people weren't doing it, A, because investors weren't asking, they started to ask, and B, because they didn't know where to start. So some of it was a function of the times, some of it was a function of we just needed to get better at this as a group, as a community. And I can assure you that this is no longer the case today, that I do that style of investing.
Carlee, do you have a page or a resource you could point us at if we are interested in
yes, I
CFOs for hire?
Sure, yes. Let me I will reach out. As I mentioned, I don't do this work any longer previously, but I believe we have someone in our audience who does this style of work. Audrey, did you want to weigh in? There's Audrey. Audrey's awesome.
Right, Audrey. I wrote that down.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody. We do it all the time. And one of the comments earlier was, it's important. It's great to have a fractional CFO, but it's important for the founder. So part of how I work with founders is you will understand it so you can speak in the way that you speak and know all of your numbers. Because I feel like that's part of my responsibility in creating these models, is to make sure you can speak intelligently and truly understand what we've put together.
You're the Audrey Group, correct?
The Audrey Company, yes.
The Audrey Company. Okay. Thank you.
Sounds like people have their brains full of information and they're processing it. It sounds like you did a good job, Carlee. Any last minute questions? All right. So everybody's going to go home tonight and stay up till 2 a.m. writing your spreadsheet and being all excited about your spreadsheet. And then you're going to go find somebody to explain the spreadsheet to. And then you're going to discover all the things you left out of the spreadsheet. And so just like you practice your pitching and you do it over and over again and iterate on it, you're going to want to do that with your spreadsheet modeling and explain your unit economics and explain your financial modeling of your marketing channels and explain why you need to hire that 5th executive assistant in your spreadsheet. But that iteration is going to be important. And that habit of running experiments to find out what the number looks like, at least to bound the number, really will serve you well, both in your customer development work as well as in your financial modeling work. Any last thoughts that you want to share, Carlee?
No, I just want to thank John for putting this together. I always find such joy in this group, and thank you all for coming with curious minds and good questions. I always find these groups helpful. I learned a few things. I hope you learned a few things, and massive thanks to John for getting everyone here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We do this every Tuesday night and every Thursday. And since you got here because you know about the Seattle Angel Meetup group. I have another 6 that I'll be adding in shortly. So there's even more interesting talks to come. If you have any particular questions, reach out to either me or to Bob Dong or John Dex or any of our angel investors that are in the room. And we're glad to see if we can help you get connected to the resources you need. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll be talking about personalized marketing on Thursday.